At 1:46 in the morning, on November 18th, 1942, a British signalman at Gibraltar copied a German position report that made no sense. Not difficult to read, not broken by static, just impossible. The message placed 11 Axis ships inside a grid square that, on the chart, sat across a strip of dry North African land. Cargo ships do not steam through olive groves. They do not cross salt flats. They do not climb hills west of Cape Bon. But there it was in clean Morse, tapped out by a German naval operator who sounded tired, rushed, and very sure of himself. Signalman Arthur Layton wrote the group down. Then he stopped. He drew a small circle around the first two characters of the grid and wrote 3 words beside it in pencil. Not at sea. That pencil note would move through 4 rooms, 2 islands, and 3 separate command chains before dawn. And before the next night fell, thousands of tons of fuel meant for Rommel's army would be burning on the surface of the Mediterranean. Arthur Layton was not the kind of man history usually notices. He was 24 years old, thin-faced, quiet, and known at the Gibraltar intercept hut for sharpening pencils down to useless little stubs because he hated a blurred number. Before the war, he had worked in the parcel office at York Station, where a single wrong digit could send a crate to Plymouth instead of Preston. In the Navy, that habit became something more dangerous. It became accuracy under pressure. For 6 months he had been sitting in a cramped wireless room above Roja Bay, copying Axis naval traffic from the central Mediterranean. The room was hot, even at night. The shutters stayed blacked out. The air smelled of dust, sweat, warm valves, and the faint metal tang of equipment that never truly cooled. Outside, Gibraltar was a fortress pretending to sleep. Searchlights swept the water in slow white arcs. Anti-aircraft crews dozed beside their guns. Convoys moved through the strait under blackout, and beyond the dark line of the sea, the entire North African campaign was being fed, starved, rescued, and strangled by shipping schedules. By November 1942, the Axis war in Africa had become a problem of fuel before it was a problem of courage. Rommel's forces needed roughly 50,000 tons of supplies a month just to keep fighting at full strength. Fuel, ammunition, spare tracks, radio batteries, medical stores, tinned food, lubricating oil. Every tank in the desert was only as useful as the next drum of petrol. Every artillery piece was only as useful as the next crate of shells. And the sea between Italy and Tunisia had become a hunting ground. The Germans and Italians still pushed convoy after convoy south through the central Mediterranean, but every passage required coordination. A ship left Naples, another left Palermo. Escorts joined near Sicily. Orders moved by cable, by courier, by radio, and by encrypted naval traffic. The system was complicated, exhausted, and full of men trying to do too much with too little sleep. That was where mistakes entered. The Kriegsmarine used a naval grid system to disguise positions at sea. Instead of saying a convoy was north of Sfax or east of Cape Bon, an operator sent a letter and number square from a private chart. To anyone without the chart, it looked meaningless. To Allied listeners who had spent months rebuilding that chart from direction-finding bearings, captured fragments, Italian plain language slips, and decrypted traffic, it was not meaningless anymore. It was a door. Not a wide-open door, a cracked one. Under good conditions, British naval intelligence could convert certain German grid squares into real positions within a workable margin. But the entire process depended on the intercepted group being right. One wrong character could shift a convoy dozens of miles. 2 wrong characters could put ships on land, or send aircraft searching empty water until the target vanished into a protected port. That was why Arthur Layton checked numbers. He had learned the German operators the way other men learned voices in a pub. One man hammered dots like he was angry. Another let his dashes sag. A third clipped every ending too short, as if he were trying to save the war one fraction of a second at a time. The operator on the 146 transmission was the clipped one. Leighton had heard him before. The signal came in on a high-frequency band just after a burst of Italian escort chatter faded under static. Leighton leaned closer to the set, one hand on the pencil, the other adjusting the headphones against his ear. The convoy identifier came first, then the escort group, then the grid. BK-2714. Leighton wrote it in block letters. 11 vessels, a mixed supply convoy, course south-southwest, speed 8 knots. Then his eyes went back to the grid. BK-27. He did not reach for the wall chart immediately. He had copied too many of these not to carry part of the sea in his head. BK-29 was water. BK-31 was water. BK-38 was a known route toward the Tunisian coast. But BK-27 was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Wrong in a way that had weight. Leighton opened the battered reference folder beside the receiver and turned to the Mediterranean overlay. His finger moved across the page. BK-27. Land. Not coastline. Not a harbor approach. Land. A position several miles inland, beyond the shallow bay, across a pale wedge of terrain where no convoy could possibly be moving at 8 knots. He could have marked it uncertain and waited. That was the safe thing, the official thing. Morse errors happened constantly. Atmospherics could swallow a dot. A tired operator could send a 2 as a 3. An allied listener could hear a clipped signal and make it fit the wrong group. But Leighton had not misheard the rhythm. The operator had sent BK-2714 clearly. That was the problem. At 1:53, the same German hand came back on the air for a correction burst, shorter this time, probably relayed to an escort. Leighton caught only the last half of the message. Convoy identifier, speed, final 4 digits, 3814. He froze. The final digits matched. The prefix had changed. BK-3814. This time the square sat in open water northeast of Tunisia, on a known supply lane that had already shown direction-finding activity earlier that night. The difference between the two positions was not a technicality. One was impossible. One was a convoy. Leighton took the original slip, underlined BK-2714, wrote BK-3814 beneath it, and then wrote his pencil note in a smaller, harder hand. Not at sea. Likely 38. It was not a heroic sentence. It was not even a complete sentence, but it gave the duty officer something rare in signals intelligence. Not just an intercept, but an argument. At 2:07 a.m., Lieutenant Martin Hale, the night intelligence officer, was pulled from a folding chair with a mug of tea cooling beside him. Hale had learned to distrust excitement in wireless rooms. Young ratings could become convinced that every unusual transmission was the hinge of the war. Most were not. Most were fragments, shadows, almosts. Then he read Leighton's note. Hale placed the two slips side by side. Same convoy identifier. Same final digits. Same operator rhythm. 2 different prefix groups. 1 square inland. 1 square on a convoy lane. He did not congratulate Leighton. He did not make a speech. He picked up the secure line and asked for the latest direction-finding plot. 3 bearings had come in between 1:30 and 2 o'clock. Gibraltar had one. Malta had one. A newly active Allied station in Algeria had a rough third, its equipment still being settled after the landings earlier that month. Individually, none of them proved much. Together, they formed a loose triangle over the sea near BK-38. Hale wrote one word at the top of the packet: corrected. Then the packet started moving. By 2:29 a.m., the corrected square had been passed to the Mediterranean operations desk. By 3:10, Malta had it. By 3:40, the air staff at Lucca were comparing it with the convoy speed, the moonset, and the range of strike aircraft. By 4:12, a surface interception plan was being revised, around a position that existed because a signalman had refused to let ships sail over dry ground. This is the part of war that disappears when history is told only through maps and famous names. On a map, an arrow moves. In reality, an arrow is made of clerks, operators, mechanics, tired officers, half-legible bearings, aircraft fitters working by lamps, and someone at a desk deciding whether a penciled doubt is strong enough to risk men's lives on. At Malta, the decision was yes. The island had been bombed so heavily that men joked about recognizing incoming aircraft by the sound of their engines. Runways had been cratered, patched, cratered again, and patched again. Fuel was guarded like blood. Aircraft were never plentiful. Crews were tired. Ships were never sent out lightly, because the Mediterranean punished mistakes quickly. But the corrected position was too strong to ignore. Just before dawn, a pair of twin-engine strike aircraft lifted off from Lucca into a gray sky, their crews briefed to search a box northeast of the Tunisian coast. Behind them, a small British striking group moved out from Malta under darkened decks, engines building speed into the open sea. The convoy they were hunting was carrying what the Desert War needed most: fuel in drums, aviation spirit, ammunition, vehicle parts, flour, field dressings, radio spares, and crates of track links for German armor that was already retreating under pressure. Those items did not look dramatic in a manifest. They were not stirring words. They were barrels, boxes, tins, and crates. But in North Africa, barrels were movement. Boxes were firepower. Crates were time. At 6:18 a.m., one of the strike aircraft found smoke on the horizon. Not battle smoke, funnel smoke. The convoy was exactly where BK-3814 said it should be. 11 merchant vessels in 2 uneven columns, screened by Italian escorts, pushing south at reduced speed in the thin morning light. The crews had no idea that their position had been compromised before dawn by an error they likely did not know had been made. The aircraft came in low. The first pass scattered the escort screen. Cannon fire walked across the deck of a tanker. Rockets struck near the stern of a freighter carrying ammunition boxes stacked under canvas. One aircraft took hits through the wing and still turned for a second pass before climbing away toward Malta. The convoy did not die in that first attack, but it slowed, and that was enough. At 7:41 a.m., the British surface group appeared on the northern horizon. For the convoy commander, the sight was worse than the aircraft. Aircraft could hit and leave. Warships stayed. They closed the distance. They chose targets. They turned a convoy into separate fires. The escorts began making smoke. The merchant captains tried to scatter toward the Tunisian coast. One tanker turned too sharply and exposed its side. Another ship, already hit from the air, fell behind, its bow down, black smoke rolling from an open hatch. The first British salvos landed short. The second walked in. A fuel ship went up in a sheet of orange flame that turned the morning sea copper. The ammunition freighter did not explode all at once. It burned in pulses, each internal blast lifting sparks and fragments into the smoke. Men on nearby vessels later said the sound was less like thunder than like heavy doors being slammed underground. Within half an hour, the convoy's formation had stopped existing. Some ships were sinking, some were burning, some were still moving, but without order, without speed, and without any clean route to safety. By the end of the action, 7 merchant vessels had been sunk or abandoned. 2 escorts were damaged badly enough to limp for port at low speed. Roughly 26,000 tons of supplies never reached the African front, including thousands of tons of fuel and enough ammunition to matter to units that were already counting shells. Numbers like that can become numb on the tongue. 26,000 tons. It sounds like accounting. But accounting was the war. A tank with no petrol is not a tank. It is a steel box. A gun with no shells is not artillery. It is a landmark. A convoy that does not arrive is not merely a naval success. It becomes an empty fuel dump, a silent repair yard, a column of trucks waiting for drums that are now at the bottom of the sea. The immediate confusion on the Axis side made the loss worse. The convoy had been hit fast enough that its distress traffic was fragmented. One escort's radio room was damaged early. A merchant transmitter failed after the first air attack. Rome and Naples received pieces, not a picture. For hours, staff officers argued over whether the convoy had scattered, turned back, entered port under radio silence, or been destroyed. That uncertainty delayed the next departures. 2 follow-on supply movements, already loaded and waiting in Italian ports, were held while route security was reviewed. Escorts had to be reassigned. Signals procedures were tightened. German officers accused Italian communications staff of carelessness. Italian officers complained that German routing instructions arrived late, incomplete, and impossible to reconcile with local conditions. The quarrel cost time. Time was the one thing the Axis front in North Africa did not have. By the 3rd week of November, fuel reports from forward units were no longer written in comfortable reserves. They were written in days, then in hours. Vehicles were cannibalized for parts. Tanks were driven only when necessary. Trucks that might have moved ammunition were held back because the fuel to move them might be needed for a retreat. And across that retreat, the effects of a small corrected square became visible in ugly, practical ways. Crews burned vehicles they could not move. Workshops abandoned engines they could have repaired if parts had arrived. Infantry columns walked past silent tanks, not because the machines had been beaten in combat, but because the supply system behind them had failed. No single convoy decided the North African campaign. That would be too neat, and war is rarely neat. El Alamein had already broken the Axis advance. Allied landings in the west had changed the strategic map. Air power, naval pressure, intelligence, logistics, weather, command decisions, and industrial weight were all pressing on the same exhausted front. But some events do not decide a war by themselves. They accelerate what is already happening. They remove options. They turn a difficult retreat into a desperate one. They take away the fuel that would have allowed a counterattack, the shells that would have slowed a pursuit, the spare parts that would have kept a few more vehicles moving for a few more days. That is why Layton's pencil note mattered. Not because it was dramatic, because it was exact. At Bletchley Park and in naval intelligence offices, the later assessment did not need poetry. It recorded the corrected grid as an important factor in fixing the target. It noted the agreement between the adjusted square and the direction-finding bearings. It noted the loss of supply tonnage and the temporary disruption of follow-on convoy routing. It did not describe the wireless room. It did not describe the hot valves, the blacked-out shutters, the worn reference folder, or the young man from York staring at a group of characters that put ships on land. Official paper rarely preserves the shape of attention. It preserves outcomes. But wars turn on attention more often than monuments admit. A lookout who sees a wake, a mechanic who hears the wrong note in an engine, a nurse who notices a fever before the chart says danger, a signalman who reads a grid square, doubts it, and checks the sea against the land. Arthur Layton stayed at Gibraltar through the winter. He copied hundreds of signals after that night. Most led nowhere. Some were duplicates. Some were useless. Some arrived too late. He was promoted the following year and sent to a shore intercept station in Britain, where the war became colder, quieter, and no less dependent on men listening in dark rooms. He never commanded a ship. He never led a charge. He never became the subject of a bronze plaque. His work left behind a different kind of trace, a copied grid, a corrected prefix, a packet moved before dawn, a convoy found where it should have been, not where the first message said it was. The North African campaign ended months later, when Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered in May 1943. Hundreds of thousands of men went into captivity. The Desert War, which had consumed ships, aircraft, fuel, steel, and lives across 3 continents, finally closed. The road to that surrender did not run through one room, but one small part of it passed through a pencil mark at Gibraltar, through a man who knew that numbers were not harmless, through 3 words written beside an impossible square: not at sea.